Hello and welcome to this video. My name's Barry Beckham. It was about 9 p.m. at night when I first put my new Canon 100 to 500mm RF zoom lens onto my Canon R5 body. It was dark, of course, and from my armchair I framed up on a vase of dried flowers about 7 meters away. I set 2000 ISO on the camera, and using an aperture of f7.1 I took this shot with the lens zoomed to its maximum 500mm. I was using aperture priority and the shutter speed that was recorded was just 1/3 of a second. Now, achieving a sharp image at 1/3 of a second shutter speed with a 500mm zoom was completely unexpected. In fact, it amazed me, and I'm not very easy to amaze. In all my photography over many years, I've used that well-known guidance rule for shutter speeds. If I was using a 200mm lens, I'd always try to achieve 0.02 of a second shutter speed. Now, that rule has always shown to be a good guide for me for many years, even though some of the later zoom lenses, of course, have included image stabilisation. That was until I saw the results here of the dried flowers with the Canon R5 and the lens set to 500mm. Now, whenever we're taking our photographs, we can all get lucky sometimes and against all the odds get a sharp shot when normally we would have no reason to expect one. I now know that this shot wasn't a fluke. It's the result of the in-body image stabilisation of the Canon R5 along with the image stabilisation of the lens combined together. And I'm becoming more and more confident in those two together. With the combination of the Canon R5 body and this lens, that old guidance rule of trying to maintain a shutter speed at least equivalent to the focal length of the lens has been overtaken by technology. So I took myself off to Noosa Botanical Gardens here in Queensland to get a feel for what I and this camera lens combination could achieve in relation to shutter speeds. So the idea was to keep the shutter speed as low as possible, and of course in doing that I'm able to keep the ISO lower than I would normally set under these conditions. But I did take the usual precautions when shooting with a long lens and slow shutter speeds. Tucked my arms into my body, leaned against a tree if one was available, and just took precautions to hold the camera as steady as I possibly could. Let's take a look and talk through some of the results. There's a couple of things you may want to bear in mind while looking at these images. You're looking at them in a slightly compressed video, so please make some allowance for that. And the images were all shot in the last hour of sunlight when the sun was very low in the sky and therefore warm in colour. Of course, when you're close to your subject and we're using a 500mm lens, there's going to be some depth of field issues, but that's not the sharpness we're talking about here. If we look at the group of flowers I focused on using the spot focus setting, they're acceptably sharp. An 1/80th of a second is still a very slow shutter speed for a 500mm lens, but it's delivered a pretty good shot. It could be argued that I could have set an aperture of f8 or maybe even f11. That would have increased the depth of focus. Of course, it would mean a shutter speed slowing down to maybe 1/40th of a second or maybe even 1/20th. But my experiences here tell me a sharp shot at f11 was possible. If we look at this shot, we can see here that the lens was actually as wide open as it can possibly be at f7.1. That's the case when you have it zoomed to its maximum of 500mm. We're shooting with an 80th of a second, but we've got a sharp shot and we've been able to retain 100 ISO. Let's just imagine for a second shooting the same shot without the benefit of any image stabilisation. With a 500mm lens, we'd be looking at trying to get 0.05 of a second shutter speed. Now, to achieve that, we would have to find 3 stops of light to go from something like 1/80th of a second to 0.05 of a second. So we can't achieve that with the aperture because that's already wide open. We would have to increase the ISO from 100 to 200 to get, let's say, 125th of a second, to 400 to get 250th of a second, but to 800 to get 0.05 of a second. Now that may not be insurmountable, but isn't it better to shoot at 100 ISO? Now, given the nature of the subject here, I zoomed back just a little bit to close to 300mm. But we're still shooting with only 100 ISO, but I've been able to stop down the aperture just a little bit to f8. But we're shooting with a 30th of a second and still able to capture a sharp shot. Here we have another example, and I should point out that none of these images have been sharpened in any way. So here we've got the lens at its maximum setting again, 500mm. Increase the ISO just a little bit because the light was beginning to fade at this point. Once again, we've got the lens aperture wide open, but we've managed to capture an acceptable shot at just 1/30th of a second. To capture this shot without image stabilisation, we'd need a tripod. Now, as I bring up one other example where we can see again 500mm, 100 ISO, f8, 1/60th of a second. In normal circumstances of just a few years ago, we would never expect to get a sharp shot hand holding a lens of that length. Not all of the images that I shot at the Botanical Gardens are quite as sharp as those I'm displaying here. There were 1 or 2 which were just a little bit blurred. But they were images where I was either in an awkward position or the shutter speed dropped well below 1/10th of a second. Now remember, with the first image that I showed, I actually got the shutter speed down to 1/3 of a second. But we need to bear in mind I was sitting nicely in a comfortable armchair, so I'm very well supported. And we do have to bear in mind that sort of situation when we're considering just how low a shutter speed we can get away with. So what does this simple shutter speed test tell us? Well, it tells us that the in-body image stabilisation, when it's coupled with the lens image stabilisation, work pretty well. Now, I'm not suggesting that we shoot with a 500mm lens right on the edge of what shutter speed we can get away with all of the time, but it's nice to know where the line is. Personally, I'd rather err a little more on the safe side, but I think this exercise has been quite an eye-opener. The benefits are pretty obvious. For most of my previous telephoto shots, I would almost always be shooting with the lens wide open. The ability to close down the aperture a stop or two with my previous 400mm lens wasn't possible without increasing the ISO. With a combination of the R5 and this 100 to 500 RF lens, we can safely keep the ISO down a little and/or increase depth of field with a smaller aperture. Another benefit is that we may be able to remove the long lens from the tripod in those situations when we need the flexibility of hand holding. Remember though that we're talking here about preventing camera shake by using image stabilisation. That's not going to help freeze the movement of fast-moving birds. Then we still need that shutter speed to be higher. Let me bring this video to a close with a short audio visual of the images I shot. Every one of them was using shutter speeds far slower than we would ever expect to get away with.